It was February 12, 2016, exactly 03:14 in the morning, in the heart of the Antarctic continent. The air inside Sector 7 of the Vostok base was heavy with the metallic smell of ozone and the constant oppressive sound of industrial pressurizers. Marcos Viana kept his eyes fixed on the thermal monitor, while his hands, accustomed to the extreme cold of special operations, trembled slightly over the steel console. He was not a scientist. He was a man trained for the worst. But what the sensors showed at that moment defied any security protocol he had operated in decades of military and private service. A few meters away, behind a reinforced titanium alloy door with pneumatic sealing, the most influential figure of the Catholic Church waited for an answer that Russian science could not provide logically. The silence in the corridors was interrupted only by the rhythmic cracking of the thermal expansion of the steel plates lining the subglacial structure. Marcos realized that the internal pressure of the base was rising uncontrollably, indicating that something 4 kilometers below the solid ice was trying to emerge. The narrator wonders if Marcos was fully aware that, at that exact moment, he was the only physical barrier between an impossible discovery and the total collapse of a diplomatic mission unprecedented in modern history. The environment was claustrophobic. The emergency lights pulsed in an amber tone that made the shadows on the walls denser and deeper. Marcos felt cold sweat dripping under his thermal uniform, while the depth monitor indicated that the level of the subglacial lake was rising against all known laws of physics for that altitude and temperature. The danger he faced was not just a structural failure, but direct contact with something that humanity had buried under the ice millennia ago. Marcos Viana had turned 52 in a conflict zone in Eastern Europe, shortly before being hired by a private security firm with direct contracts with the Vatican State. His technical file was impeccable, describing a man of few words, nerves of steel, and an almost mathematical efficiency in extreme crisis situations. He had been specifically selected for his ability to maintain absolute secrecy and his history in isolated environments. He was in Antarctica to coordinate the security logistics of what was officially called by the international press the Ecumenical Glacial Research Expedition. The routine at Vostok Base was dictated by the artificial biological clock of LED lights, since the sun was a distant concept at that time of year, where darkness was total and merciless. Marcos managed grueling 12-hour shifts, monitoring perimeters through infrared cameras and ensuring that no one, absolutely no one, approached the deep drilling known in technical records as Hole 5G. Daily life was marked by the bureaucratic monotony of checking oxygen levels, fuel stock for generators, and the integrity of the vacuum seals of the decontamination chambers. The mission proceeded predictably until the arrival of the Russian delegation accompanied by high-ranking papal delegates. On that specific early morning, Marcos was covering the shift of a colleague who had suffered sudden and inexplicable hypothermia after a routine check outside the base. He accepted the double shift without question, moved by the sense of duty that had accompanied him since the army, while the rest of the base slept or participated in the private. Meeting on the upper levels, Marcos remained in the control center, surrounded by screens monitoring the oldest ice crust on Earth. It was then that the first signal appeared on the geophysics console, a thermal pulse originating exactly 4,000 meters deep in the geometric center of Lake Vostok. The sensor recorded a temperature increase of 15 degrees Celsius in just 10 seconds, a phenomenon that had no documented volcanic or geothermal explanation in that specific region. For an environment that had remained stable and frozen for millions of years, that was the equivalent of a catastrophic silent anomaly occurring directly under his feet. Marcos's first reaction to the anomaly was the professional skepticism of someone who has seen many hardware errors in extreme climates. He followed the redundancy protocol methodically, restarting the data reception servers and checking the integrity of the fiber optic cables that ran down the main observation well. The narrator observes that Marcos tried to rationalize the situation, attributing the error to a likely short circuit caused by the immense pressure of hundreds of atmospheres on the mercury sensors down there. He performed the system diagnostics 3 times, waiting for the numbers to return to normal. However, the standard protocol had no effect, and the anomaly persisted, becoming increasingly aggressive on the frequency charts. Upon opening the manual incident report to record the technical failure, he noticed that the pH meter of the subglacial water had also suffered a drastic and sudden change, moving toward an acidity compatible with biological or gastric fluids. Intrigued and following his security instinct, Marcos decided to perform a physical inspection of the secondary drainage duct, located in basement level 4, the heavy maintenance area for the drilling machines. As he descended the cold metal stairs, the sound of the ice cracking outside seemed louder, almost as if the base were being squeezed by giant hands. When he reached the compartment, he did not find clean water or the ice crystals expected for the purification system. What he saw was a viscous fluid of a deep and organic crimson tone, slowly leaking through the pressure relief valves. The liquid exhaled intense heat, generating a dense and ferrous mist that obscured vision and made the use of emergency flashlights almost useless. As he brought his hand close and touched the outer wall of the stainless steel duct, Marcos felt the metal vibrate rhythmically, as if there were a heartbeat occurring inside the piping. The standard chemical leak protocol was automatically activated by the base system, but the suction and filtration pumps simply jammed upon contact with the substance. The familiar technical atmosphere of the base suddenly became hostile and strange, transforming a science outpost into a biological nightmare setting. Marcos reported the visual and technical anomaly immediately to the base central command and the Pope's personal security team through the high-priority encrypted radio channel. He expected an emergency response, the sound of sirens, or the immediate arrival of a hazardous materials containment team. Instead, what he received was an absolute silence that lasted almost 2 minutes, a communication vacuum unthinkable in a military operation of that magnitude. When the voice of the general in charge of the base finally emerged through the loudspeaker, the tone was not of alarm or concern, but of a cold, calculated, and deeply authoritative calm. The command ordered Marcos to manually seal the maintenance compartment on level 4, declare a false fire alarm only in Sector 7 to prevent panic, and lead the Vatican delegation to the surface airfield immediately, without passing through common areas. Upon attempting to question the nature of the fluid and the risk of biological contamination to the structure, Marcos was abruptly interrupted with a direct order to ignore everything he had seen under penalty of immediate cut of his reserve benefits and transferred to military custody for breach of secrecy protocol. The narrator details how Marcos realized, through the tone of voice of his superiors, that they were not surprised by the crimson fluid emerging from the ice. They were merely waiting for the exact moment when the containment would fail. The sense of isolation became physical when he noticed that his access password to the main geology system files had been remotely revoked while he was still in the service corridor. His shift colleagues, who once cracked jokes about the cold, now passed him with vacant stares, avoiding any eye contact, as if they were following a previously established script of denial. Marcos was alone with what he had discovered, surrounded by an institutional structure that preferred silence to logical survival. Despite the direct threat and psychological pressure, Marcos's technical curiosity and survival instinct led him to commit an act of insubordination that would permanently change his perception of reality. Before starting the evacuation protocol for the delegation, he connected an external diagnostic drive, a piece of his personal property, to one of the remaining serial ports of the ground penetration sensor that still operated independently in the basement. He knew time was short, and that surveillance cameras would be reviewed. During the few minutes the data was being transferred, he cross-referenced the thermal pulse information with old NOAA geological records, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration of the United States, dating back to the 1970s. What he found, hidden under layers of old encryption, was a document classified as confidential that indicated that Vostok Base had not been originally built for climate research, but for the continuous monitoring of a planetary-scale biological anomaly. The crimson fluid was not blood in the human sense of the term, but a highly dense and iron-rich form of biomass generated by geothermal activity that the Russian documents called the Great Vent. This is where the story gets strange, and the narrator asks you to pay attention to this crucial technical detail. The records indicated that every 500-year cycle, this organic mass reached a chemical boiling point, requiring interventions that mixed advanced science with containment rituals that modern science could not, or would not, explain publicly. Marcos saw grainy photos of previous, secret drillings, where the ice displayed perfect fractal patterns that mimicked the structure of veins, arteries, and capillaries on a kilometer scale. He realized that the Pope was not there to bless the ice, but to witness what the Vatican called in its internal archives the blood of the Earth, a substance they believed had physical reality-altering properties. The evacuation of Vostok Base was executed under the shroud of total polar night darkness and an absolute secrecy that bordered on the paranoid. The Pope was removed from the base wrapped in heavy thermal blankets and escorted by a phalanx of Swiss guards armed with automatic rifles, being taken directly to a C-130 Hercules aircraft that was waiting on the ice runway with engines already at maximum rotation. Marcos was one of the last to leave the site, being transported on a separate flight to an intermediate Russian base before being sent back to his home in a coastal town months later. However, the return to civilization did not bring the expected peace. The narrator describes how institutional pressure began to manifest in Marcos's personal life in subtle, persistent, and terrifying ways. He noticed that his personal emails were frequently deleted before he could read them, and the constant presence of black utility vehicles, without official license plates, parked exactly 1 block from his residence, became part of his new routine. One night in May, Marcos received a call on his landline that lasted exactly 14 seconds, during which there was no human voice, only the sound of heavy breathing and a rhythmic metallic noise that he immediately recognized as the vibration of the Sector 7 ducts. The fear was no longer about his job, it was about his physical integrity and sanity. They systematically attempted to discredit Marcos, sending fake psychiatric reports of post-traumatic stress to all his potential employers in the security sector, suggesting that his memories of the crimson fluid and the Pope's flight were the result of psychotic breaks caused by hypoxia and the extreme isolation of the Antarctic altitude. He was transformed into a social ghost, a man who knew too much and who was now watched by those he once protected. The partial revelation of what actually happened at Vostok Base came when Marcos finally managed, using military-grade decoding software, to open the last part of the raw data he had extracted from the ground sensor. What he saw in the density charts was not just a fluid moving, but a complex geometric structure that extended for hundreds of miles under the polar ice cap. Lake Vostok was not just a geographically isolated body of water. It was what the secret documents now explicitly called the primordial gestation chamber. The meeting of the Supreme Pontiff with the Russian geophysicists and military was not of a traditional diplomatic or religious nature, but was a desperate effort of coordination between political and spiritual power to understand why the natural ice seal was melting from the bottom up so rapidly. The real danger Marcos faced was not just contact with the crimson fluid, but what the temperature and composition of that biomass indicated about the awakening of a biological consciousness that humanity had forgotten or tried to erase from its historical records. Marcos understood, with a cold terror, that Antarctica was not a continent of earth and ice, but a colossal physical lid that was beginning to vibrate and give way under the heat and pressure of an ancient, vast, and hungry life form that resided in the planet's core. He managed to see, in the final seconds before being removed from the engine room, that the substance in the duct was beginning to form patterns that resembled complex nerve tissues, He was within inches of touching the truth, but the security system and the bureaucracy of fear removed him before the full revelation could be processed by his mind. The climax of that discovery was stifled by international silence agreements, leaving Marcos with only fragments of a reality that he can never fully prove. The outcome of this investigation does not involve medals of honor, interviews on major television networks, or any kind of public recognition. Marcos Viana was coerced into signing a strict confidentiality agreement, valid for 20 years under the severest clauses of the Russian national security law and international defense cooperation protocols. He was officially fired for alleged technical negligence and lives today under a monitored identity in a location he prefers not to disclose, aware that any attempt to bring his original digital proof to the public will result in his permanent and irrevocable disappearance. Vostok Base continues to operate normally, issuing standardized and predictable climate reports to the world scientific community, while new and thick layers of lead-reinforced concrete are silently poured over Sector 7 during winter storms. The institutional system continues to function perfectly, protecting a reality that most people could not process without a psychological collapse. This case forces us to look at the edges of our map and question what really lies beneath the ice layers that we consider eternal and immutable. What Marcos saw in that duct may be the harbinger of a cycle that humanity is not prepared to face again. From where are you following this investigative dossier? Comment your city and country below so we can map the reach of this information. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel for access to more case reports that the major institutions would prefer stayed buried under the eternal ice.